All this blood. All these men dead because of you.
You were the one that hanged an innocent man.
An American production about a British legend, filmed in Serbia and starring an Australian. We're talking Robin Hood, the 10-episode series from MGM Plus and Amazon. And this one stars Sean Bean. Now, originally I wasn't actually going to watch this series because, you know, there was always, oh, it's really kind of woke kind of thing going on and before it sort of came out. But Robin Hood is actually one of my sort of favourite subject matters, and the 80s TV show Robin of Sherwood is actually my favourite TV show of all time. So I wanted to give it a try, and also because I quite like Sean Bean. And we are going to touch on the woke stuff in a little bit, but I kind of want to talk about the series as a whole, the positives and negatives outside of that, and then we'll kind of circle back to that and my thoughts on it. So yes, I have watched this whole series now, and you know, I will say right from the get-go, for the most part, I actually quite enjoyed this series. It's clearly influenced by Game of Thrones, so much so that it's sort of even a little bit derivative of it, I would say. So the story is a kind of a retelling of the Robin Hood legend, as you'd probably expect, as he ends up becoming an outlaw, and the reasons for that, his growing rivalry with the Sheriff of Nottingham, played by Sean Bean, his forming of his kind of band of outlaws, the growing sort of animosity between the Normans and the Saxons, which is a point of contention for some people, and I'll explain why in a minute. And you know, we get other kind of scenes involving the Queen Eleanor in London, and lots of kind of action, lots of kind of political manoeuvring, very much inspired by sort of Game of Thrones, methinks. What will happen? You'll have to watch the series and find out. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a longer review because I have quite a lot to say about it, and I kind of want to go into a little bit of in-depth detail about it. So we're going to start off with what works, and as part of that I actually want to talk about a lot of the characters that I think this series does really well, and then I'll kind of incorporate some of the more general elements that I think really well. But we'll kind of go through the characters, and then I'll kind of branch off into some elements of the series that I think works really well. So let's start off with its main named actor here, Sean Bean. Sean Bean plays the Sheriff of Nottingham, and you know, obviously if you're a fantasy fan, he's been in obviously the Lord of the Rings movies, he's been in Game of Thrones, so he has this sort of fan base of kind of medieval fantasy, if you like, and you know, he doesn't disappoint here. And I gotta say, I really like the Sheriff of Nottingham in this series. One of the things I liked about this series as a whole, and some of it's to its detriment, but for the most part, I think some of the characters are actually quite well written. Not all of them. The Sheriff of Nottingham is one of them. Why do I say that? So this is a mixture of Bean's performance and the writing. So the Sheriff of Nottingham here is portrayed to be a lot fairer than he is in previous iterations. Like at the beginning of the series, the first couple of episodes, he's actually quite a fair ruler, you know, or administrator at least of Nottingham, ruling in the king's stead, you might say. And he's really sort of his kind of like antagonist sort of character is really out of his duty for upholding the law. So for example, the growing animosity between him and Robin Hood starts with Robin Hood's father, who is a forester, and his father is arrested and is sort of blamed for a crime he didn't commit by someone else, Earl of Huntington, which is kind of a secondary villain in this series. But the Sheriff of Nottingham is actually kind of quite fair. When you've got to bear in mind this is sort of 12th century England, and bear in mind the law here was probably a little bit more extreme than it is now. But he does give, although he does try to obviously stick to the law of the land, he's actually sort of relatively fair, you know, in comparison. And it's only because of, as I say, underhandedness through other characters that he ends up executing Robin Hood's father, which of course sets the sort of stage for these two becoming bitter enemies. But for the most part, he's actually, as I say, quite kind of litigious with the law, and quite a kind of lawful character, not an evil character. And Bean's portrayal, and obviously Bean is a veteran actor at this point, and he gives this sort of earnest performance. And Bean's kind of getting on there in age, so he has this kind of wizened sort of feel about him. So I really enjoyed the Sheriff of Nottingham, and you know, in this series he is the King's cousin. And he's sort of quite loyal to the king. There's a lot of kind of like political machinations with Queen Eleanor, the other kind of named actor in this series. So, but he is very much trying to kind of stick to the law of the land. So it makes it for a much more of an interesting character. The other thing as well that makes this sort of series, to spinning off from that I think is quite interesting, and I give it props for, again, some of the writing here. The spark of the rebellion is really caused by just one Norman soldier getting killed. And I quite like the fact, because you've got to bear in mind the population in England at that time was nowhere near the numbers that it is now. So one Norman soldier being killed by Robin Hood sparks this kind of, and it's taken seriously, it sparks this kind of chain of events. So that they sort of take it seriously. The Norman soldiers, at least initially in this sort of series, aren't like faceless goons that are just killed off like stormtroopers. The death of one Norman soldier really is part of the catalyst for this whole story. And I kind of quite like that. The fact that they took the murder of one Norman soldier so seriously. So again, props to the writing in that. The second character I want to talk about, who I really liked, was Marian. Now, I'm not a particularly romantic person at heart, it has to be said. But I think the character of Marian, for all of you who are more romantic, I honestly felt that the romance between her and Robin Hood was very well realised. It genuinely felt quite like moving at times, and I thought she was actually quite a wonderful character, showing real strength, but not becoming like a girl boss or anything like that. You know, for all the kind of the woke accusations that this series might have, she's feisty, and she's kind of quite strong in her own way, but not in the like a physical sense, if that makes sense. She's kind of just quite has strength of character. I thought her romance with the Robin Hood character was very, very well realised. You genuinely felt the chemistry between the two of these characters, and you kind of felt that growing kind of romance. And I said, even for someone who really isn't that romantically inclined, I was actually quite invested in their kind of relationship. I also really like the fact that she has a female friend in this kind of new character, I suppose, Priscilla, who is the daughter of the Sheriff of Nottingham. And Priscilla is a character who I have a little bit of mixed feelings about, admittedly. And she's a much more of a kind of a slutty sort of character, if that makes sense. She's very much likes to kind of get around, and she's a bit more rebellious maybe. But I like the fact that they have this kind of friendship, so that Marian and Priscilla, when they're actually quite different sort of characters, but they still have this kind of like friendship because they are more highborn, and they kind of, their difference is, you know, Marian's always kind of getting the gossip because, you know, Priscilla's so salacious and things like this, and Priscilla's trying to kind of get Marian to be a little bit more on the wild side and stuff. So I thought their kind of friendship really worked, and it's good to have this kind of, you know, other sort of relationships in this sort of, you know, the kind of this series. There are some other new characters that I think work pretty well. They actually expand the kind of the merry men, so to speak, with some kind of newer characters or lesser known characters. There is like another female kind of outlaw that kind of gets introduced. So it's almost is set up to be a kind of like a love triangle. And we're going to come on to this again in the negatives, because I do think they overdid this a little bit. But there's kind of a, you know, a bit of a romantic love triangle between this other kind of female, you know, outlaw and stuff. And she's kind of got these two brothers, and they're sort of just kind of poachers and things. But I kind of quite like the character, and she kind of dresses as a boy to kind of try and sort of blend in a little bit like Arya Stark did in the Game of Thrones and stuff. So, you know, that was kind of, I quite liked her character, and she has quite a good sort of character growth, I would say. Another character I really enjoyed was Tuck, who is quite different from Iterations. He's a lot fitter in this iteration about than other ones. And here he's portrayed as a Norman monk who is now hanging around with these kind of Saxons. But he's kind of like he tempers Robin Hood's more impetuous kind of impulses, and he is a bit more of the voice of reason. And, you know, he's kind of really more of the brains of the operation. So I kind of quite liked him, and I think his portrayal, again, very likeable character, and I think the sort of somewhat of an animosity because he's of Norman ancestry rather than Saxon. And it gives a little bit of animosity between him and the kind of the outlaws, which are primarily Saxons. Don't worry, I'm going to come on to the whole Saxon thing in a minute. But nonetheless, I still felt that they had a kind of a sort of a decent sort of, you know, relationship. I liked the character. I thought the acting was kind of solid by him. So there's some real kind of standout sort of characters for me. They're the ones to me that sort of stood out. There's some other characters here that I thought were pretty good, but a little mixed. There's a couple of like minor characters, like the captain of the guard from the Normans. I actually thought he had quite a respectful relationship with the sheriff of Nottingham. He doesn't get a huge amount of screen time, but I liked him being quite a loyal kind of sort of number two, so to speak. And this is where I kind of come into Robin Hood, where I have somewhat of a mixed opinion about it. But we'll talk about the good first of all. You know, I did find the character quite well written. Like Robin Hood here, one of the things I did like about Robin Hood is that he's quite hot-headed, and he gets himself in trouble. And a lot of the kind of the issues that he has to deal with are of his own making. For example, as I've mentioned, there's a Norman soldier which is killed, and I think he's actually a captain, by Robin Hood, because ultimately Robin Hood sort of loses his shit and ends up kind of killing him in anger, when he could have just turned the other cheek and kind of, you know, but he doesn't. And this starts the kind of the wheel in motion. And so a lot of the trouble that Robin Hood gets himself in is actually of his own making. But I quite liked it because it kind of gives this character somewhat of a flawed kind of personality in a way. In this series as well, it's less about being outlaws in regards to robbing the rich and giving to the poor, and it's more about a kind of a revolutionary movement, which has been incorporated into kind of some iterations of Robin Hood, but it's much more of a kind of almost like a rebellion rather than kind of robbing money and things like that, which they don't ultimately do a whole lot of. There's one instance or one or two instances where they do that, but for the most part it's more of a social movement, I guess you would kind of say, which I think makes the stakes a little bit greater, I will say. So outside of character stuff, what can I say that this series does offer on the positives? It being shot in Serbia, it makes use of some good sorts of historical buildings and architecture and stuff like that. And I will say the production value here is quite good. If you're a fan of the kind of the high production value that we've seen in Game of Thrones, you know, lots of kind of extras, lots of sort of, you know, as I say, just buildings and kind of of the time, lots of kind of men on horseback, lots of kind of armour and things like this, big battle sequences. I think, you know, you'll enjoy it. I'd also say that the tone is quite similar to Game of Thrones. Again, maybe it ends up being a little bit too derivative. There is quite a lot of sex, there's quite a lot of violence, there's almost, you know, sort of more, you know, swearing and things like this. This series definitely is trying to be more adult than, you know, maybe your kind of TV Saturday afternoon sort of style Robin Hood series that we've kind of seen. So it has more of an edge to it. Some other aspects that I quite enjoyed. I like that Robin Hood's men primarily use archery. They do end up in kind of hand-to-hand combat in some situations, but nonetheless, I for the most part they are archers, because a lot of them are sort of foresters and poachers and things like this. So they use archery as a kind of primary weapon, whilst the Normans tend to be using more crossbows or, you know, sword and shield and things like that. So it's sort of, again, it gives it that sort of little bit of a dichotomy between these two kind of classes, which is really kind of the theme of this series, is that it's kind of a class war, because this series depicts the Normans as the kind of the ruling class, with the Saxons being the sort of underclass. Now, if you're not familiar with British history, and this is where we're going to start to veer into the negatives, but it takes some liberties with history, so to speak. In the time period where this was set, to be honest with you, Britain was effectively a Christian country at this point. There wasn't really the kind of like this big Saxon kind of population, you know, pagans, whatever you want to call them. Pretty much everyone had converted to Christianity at this point, whilst in this it's kind of not the case. It has this kind of class sort of warfare, so to speak, and the Saxons are the kind of the underclass, which are the more, you know, sort of Celtic Germanic sort of style sort of characters, if you see what I mean. So historically, it's not really correct. I kind of understood what they went for it in a story element, because it gives it this sort of class system, if you like, and you have these clear dividing lines. You've got the kind of the Normans, who are the kind of the ruling class, and the Saxons, which are kind of more of the indigenous people, who are the kind of put upon people, the sort of the ruled, so to speak. Even though at this point in history, you know, it ultimately wasn't really the case. So, that being said, you know, Robin Hood is a fictional character, so I do think you can take some creative license. If you are a stickler for history, it may annoy you. But, you know, Robin Hood has a variety of different iterations. I'm not opposed to things being changed for dramatic license, especially when you are dealing with a fictional character. Yes, I think there are some historical elements here that I would have probably preferred they kept to the time, but it doesn't gall me that much, to be honest with you, where I'm not going to kind of not watch something because of this. And anyway, other previous Robin Hood iterations have, you know, bended the rules in regards to the time period or things like that, introduced more mysticism. As I've mentioned, Robin of Sherwood introduced a kind of a level of mysticism here, which this actually does to a degree, but not to the degree that Robin of Sherwood does, to be honest with you. So, you know, there's some things here that I think, you know, may or may not bother you, depending on your kind of your outlook. But I think just for a kind of a story element, I kind of think it still works, and it's a clear delineation between these kind of two factions, and people who maybe aren't as familiar with, you know, English history may find it more helpful to have two kind of different sects of people, so to speak. So I understand why they did do that for a storytelling perspective, but I can understand the criticism from a historical perspective. So let me just come back to Robin Hood himself for a minute, and this is where I'm gonna say some other sort of good things. I think the character is well written, and I don't think he's necessarily badly performed, but he's kind of not one of the better actors, I will say. The actor is Australian, and you do hear the Australian accent come through here and there. I don't think it's necessarily a bad performance, but he's not quite nailed that accent. which, considering he is an English folk hero, and yes, I know Kevin Costner had an American accent in The Prince of Thieves, but, you know, that I would criticise that film about it. But anyway, yeah, so here it's not quite as bad as that, but you can still hear the Australian twang sort of come through from time to time. I don't think he's necessarily a bad actor. I think he's quite well written, and I think he has a good romance, as I say, with Marian, and I liked his relationship with other characters, the Sheriff of Nottingham, etc. I don't think the actor is especially charismatic, I have to say. He's not bad, but he's not especially charismatic. I think other actors in this series come across as more interesting and more charismatic than Robin Hood. I also think he looks a little bit too modern. So I would have, and this is not the actor's fault, this is hair and makeup and things like that. I just think he looks a little bit too modern. I would have liked to have seen him a little bit more, you know, with stubble, a little more dirty, a little more his hair sort of grown out and things like this. He just looks a little bit too kind of clean cut and modern for the kind of the time period that we have. And that's generally a criticism I have with a lot of the characters in this. There are times when you do see people who are kind of muddied up and stuff, but for a lot of the time, you wouldn't think these characters are out living in the forest. They look a little bit too clean, a little bit too clean cut at times. Again, we are talking a fictionalized version of history here. It's not necessarily trying to be particularly kind of realistic, but nonetheless, it has to be said that, you know, it looks a little bit too clean and tidy at times. And the last thing I'll say on the positives, there's some good battle sequences here. I quite enjoyed them. You normally have like one action sequences per episode, and I thought they were actually kind of quite well staged. So let's now just into fully what I think are the negatives in this series. And we're going to kind of go back to some of the characters. And we're going to start off with a couple of characters which I just think are massively shortchanged. Will. And it's not even clear if this is Will Scarlet, because if in the original poems there are actually two characters called Will, and I'm not sure if this is meant to be Will Scarlet or the other Will, because this is actually Robin's cousin, and he kind of ends up kind of just getting forgotten about. He's in the first half of the series, he goes to London, and then we don't see him anymore. You may as well have not had him in this series, to be honest with you, and introduce him maybe in a series 2. He absolutely contributes nothing to this series. A complete waste of a character in the kind of the, you know, he's in Nottingham and Sherwood in the initial couple of episodes. He goes off to London, we see him a couple more times, and then we never see him again. Pointless character. I did not like the way they handled Will, even though I didn't even know who this, if it is Will Scarlet or another Will. And the fact that he's actually related to Robin Hood, and at the end of this series, he's really the only family that Robin Hood has actually left. The other one who I think is wasted is Guy of Gisborne. He's only in the last 2 episodes, and considering he is probably, outside of the Sheriff of Nottingham, the most recognisable villain in the kind of the Robin Hood mythos, I think he is wasted. They didn't really get a particularly kind of exciting actor. He doesn't have a huge amount of screen time, and he comes across as more of just a thug than anything else. He was a kind of an assassin in the original poems, and, you know, he doesn't have a huge sort of story in that, and he is killed in the original poems. But in later media, his role has been expanded a lot, and I think it could make for a kind of an interesting kind of undervillain, which leads me to the kind of the secondary villain in this series, which is the Earl of Huntington, who is Marian's father in this, and he to me is much more of a kind of a mustache twirling villain. You know, he's not the acting isn't bad, I'll give him that, but I think his character seems like very much of a kind of a stereotypical villain here. You know, I wasn't a huge fan, and his kind of story arc here seems quite obvious to me. Not badly played, as they say, but he very much comes across as somewhat of a kind of a cookie cutter villain. and it's there really just to kind of stoke fires more than anything else. Little John is, and we're going to come on to him again in the woke section of this review, but outside of that, I've got to say I think he's the actor here is quite weak. He's kind of coming across as, I'm the hard Little John, I'm this kind of badass or whatever, and it's just, he's always got this kind of growl. And it's just like you're trying too hard. It's just trying too hard. I did not think the acting was strong from this character. Outside of the fact that he's a black guy, and again, we'll come on to that in this. That's not what I'm. It's nothing to do with my criticism now. The acting just wasn't very good. I also think he's quite poorly written. He's introduced as kind of as a bounty hunter, and he goes after Robin Hood, and he just kind of changes his mind because he just does. And again, I thought that was incredibly poorly written. How he just kind of changes his mind because he sort of sees a vision of some naked woman, and he's just like, I thought that was incredibly poor. So yeah, I didn't really like the big Little John character in this. Doesn't really have a huge amount to do. He's just there to kind of look surly and growl a lot, really. I didn't really think he was particularly strong here. So, it's a little bit of a mixed bag in regards to some of the sort of characters. Other criticisms I have, before we kind of get on to the woke critique, which I'll come on to, there are a couple of times where I think the kind of CGI sort of backgrounds are a little bit obvious. When they use practical sets and kind of location tuning, I think this series looks great. But there's one or two times where I feel it uses these kind of CGI establishing shots and kind of backgrounds. It doesn't look particularly strong, I've got to say. It's not overused, I'll say that, but it doesn't look brilliant when they do use it. Let's talk about London. All right, so in this series' struggle to become the new Game of Thrones, it is determined to have lots of scenes of political manoeuvring, intrigue, backstabbing, betrayals and things like this. So a lot of this comes from London scenes. So Marian and Will both separately end up kind of going to London and end up serving in the court of Eleanor, who is the queen to King Henry II, who is not in this series. He's out in France somewhere, I think. And this, to me, these scenes bog this series down because it feels so, it's clear that Eleanor is trying to be this series' Cersei from Game of Thrones. It's lots of backstabbing, it's lots of, as I say, manoeuvring, and I don't really think it particularly works. I think we spend too much time here. I really didn't feel the scenes that take place in London really amount to very much. We were introduced to kind of like her kind of like this guy, I can't remember his name now, this lord, and he ends up kind of like having a thing with the Sheriff of Nottingham's daughter. And again, you don't really feel it really goes anywhere. It's just filling up with hot air, and these characters are all of whom are betraying one another or sleeping with one another and things like this. So those scenes, which I would say, probably from episodes 4 to 8, we spent a lot of time in London, and there's a couple of interesting things that happen, but for the most part, I feel whenever we switch to London, it's like, it's not as interesting. Those scenes are just simply not as interesting. It feels like it's trying to be too derivative of Game of Thrones. I think the Eleanor character is a little bit misjudged. The acting isn't bad, but it's just like, it just seems like Temu Cersei, if you ask me. The other thing as well, this series wants to have all these love triangles. Everyone gets a love triangle. Everyone gets like, lots of salacious kind of romances and things like this. Obviously with Marian and Robin is established, fine. But maybe, okay, I grant you maybe there's not that many female characters in Robin Hood lore. So I understand why they've introduced a few. You know, we've got the other sort of female outlaw, Ralph, I think she goes by. We've got Queen Eleanor. We've got Priscilla, who is the daughter of the Sheriff of Nottingham. We've kind of got the Queen's bitchy sort of handmaiden, whose name escapes me. And they're all kind of involved in one way or another with kind of a variety of salacious kind of love affairs. You know, we've got Robin Hood with the love triangle between Ralph and Marian. We've got Priscilla, she's kind of involved with the Queen's right-hand man, and then the captain and the guards. And of course we've got the father trying to control her. We've got this handmaiden who's involved with the Queen's right-hand man, who's now a love rival with Priscilla, and so on and so forth. So this movie is trying to have this kind of sexiness that kind of Game of Thrones had, with all these kind of like sex sequences and, you know, forbidden romances and stuff like that. And again, I feel like it's just trying to be Game of Thrones a little bit too much. I don't think it needed to be quite as heavy-handed with that, and some of it I feel is just a little bit, you know, it feels like it's, some of it doesn't feel organic. It just feels like it's, oh, let's have some sort of kind of like love triangle, let's have some affair, let's have some sort of like lover's betrayal, etc., etc. And we need to have these female characters all doing this kind of stuff because this is the writing that they want to do, but it doesn't feel organic. And I think you could have dialed back a little bit on that, and it'd be a little bit more kind of effective, to be honest with you. So, you know, there are scenes here that I feel a derivative of Game of Thrones, and B, kind of just slow the series down a little bit. It's just most interesting when it's kind of in Nottingham and Sherwood, because that's what you're watching this for. It's the Robin Hood series with, you know, the rebellion and stuff like that, the merry men, the kind of the fight against the Sheriff of Nottingham, etc. I feel a lot of this other kind of sequences, and I you know, fine, you would have a few there, but it just spends too much kind of time there. So there's that. Okay, so let's address the woke elephant in the room. Now, whether you want to watch this because it has, you know, air quote woke elements or not, is going to be up to you. So they cast, there's a couple of things here that I want to talk about. Probably the most obvious one is obviously the fact that they've cast a black guy as Little John. Now, this isn't the first time that you have diversity in Robin Hood, but I think it could have been handled better, to be honest with you, and we'll talk about some examples of how that has worked previously in other Robin Hood adaptations. I think in this day and age, to be honest with you, however, it's kind of like a hot button topic. It just seems to be a flare-up point for some. Now, I have my criticisms with the Little John character outside of the race, you know. So, but let's talk about it, all right? Let's have a discussion about it. The Little John is a black Saxon, right? He's a black character. Now, in previous iterations of Robin Hood, we have introduced ethnic minorities in the Robin Hood mythos. The first one to do this was Robin of Sherwood, which is my favourite TV show. And they introduced Nazir, who was a Muslim character. And he was kind of introduced really just because I like the actor. And they just kind of wrote him in. And he was an Arabic character that had not existed before. And then, since then, other Robin Hood iterations, probably most famous, the Morgan Freeman character in Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, but other ones as well, as a kind of a Saracen or a Moor who has come over to England with Robin Hood, or, you know, has been some sort of Saracen that's been ended up with the kind of the Robin Hood sort of crew. And although that's probably fairly unlikely in real life. I think as a story element, it works better than just having Little John be a black Saxon, all right? Because it's you can kind of buy into it in a kind of more of a as a storytelling technique. Now, in reality, if there had been a Saracen outlaw, he would have 100% have been executed had he ever been caught. And he was unlikely to be kind of just walking around and anything like that. But I guess just as a storytelling device, you know, if you look at, for example, Robin Hood Sherwood, the character of Nazir was a slave to a lord, and he was freed by Robin Hood, joined the outlaws, and you could kind of buy it. I think that would have been a better route to go down. The more organic route, it's a story reason why you might have someone from a different ethnic background in 12th century England. That's not what they did. He's a black Saxon, so that's what it is. But let's just kind of like, could there be a black Saxon? Right, so there is, I guess you could argue that the Romans were in Britain, hundreds of years before this, and they did have men from Africa. So you could arguably say that there's a small chance, I mean, obviously the Romans were long gone at this point in the 12th century, that there may have been a descendant from Roman colonisers in the UK back when they were there. But even then, it was like North African, conscripts and stuff that they had. It wasn't like sub-Saharan Africans and stuff. So, it's pretty much a, not really going to be historically accurate at any point. Now, I would even say it may have gone over a little bit better had anyone in this series actually kind of commented on it, but they don't. Now, had there been a, just happens to be a black guy living in the UK, bear in mind that black people in the UK, let's say in 1977, when Star Wars came out, was less than 1% of the populace. In the 12th century, there's barely, you're not likely to have any black people in the UK, to be honest with you. There's a small chance that you might get a trader or something from somewhere else, but, historically, it's just not going to be there. Which, I guess, look, if you just want to ignore that, fine. But at least have characters address it in the show. Like, because they wouldn't have seen someone with that kind of skin tone. So, but no one ever comments on it. It's never brought up. But it's just one of these things that are kind of like, that it just kind of sticks out. And the other weird thing is there's no other black characters in it. So, if you're going to have this kind of introduce this, then introduce it. You just have one black character and no one talks about it. No one kind of just says, what's this? Where'd you come from? Or anything like that. Doesn't it? So it kind of, I kind of get the criticism. Now, has it stopped me from watching the show? Clearly not, because I've watched it. I understand the criticism, but in defence, we are talking about maybe not a fantasy show, but a fictionalised character. Yes, it takes place in a kind of a real historical context, real historical time. There's other inconsistencies that I can see. The Saxons were not really a thing in 12th century England. Britain had really become a Christian country for the most part. There might have been a few pockets here and there, but there wasn't really this kind of like large swathes of the populace, which were, Saxons and stuff at that point in time. So, again, there's some historical kind of inaccuracies. Look, it's a fictional character. It depends how kind of anal you want to be about history and stuff, or if you just want to watch a somewhat entertaining show, because it is an entertaining show. The other thing I would say that there is a criticism that I've seen that it's been compared, complained that it's being woke because it's anti-Christian. And the fact that the church here is depicted as a bad guy. I would disagree with that. I would say because the church isn't necessarily depicted as a whole as a kind of antagonistic force. We have one bishop who is kind of a character that works with the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is shown as being corrupt. but I wouldn't say it certainly doesn't paint the whole of the church like that. It's just one character. And again, this is something that has been depicted in previous iterations of Robin Hood. And again, I'll go back to Robin of Sherwood, which again had the church as, or at least the abbot of the church being a corrupt member of the clergy. So this is nothing new. This is stuff that has been kind of like put in kind of Robin Hood series way before now. So I think, look, with the kind of the woke stuff, you're going to watch it or you're not. To me, that's not going to affect my score. Yes, I would have preferred it be more historical accurate, to be honest with you. Because we are talking about a real time in history. To me, it's not. It doesn't break the show. It's kind of like it's certainly not my preference. I would have preferred it to be, as I say, cast more historically accurate. Have the people be more accurately portrayed as by the times. It needs to look a little bit more like that. But at the end of the day, it's a fictionalized character and a fictionalized depiction of events in real time England. So there you go. So based on everything other than the kind of the whole woke stuff, what do I think of this show? I enjoyed it. I have some critiques with it. I think there were some mistakes that were made. I think the first half of the first 4 episodes I think are fairly strong, and the last 2 are fairly strong. But I think sort of the middle episodes where we spend a lot of time in London, they lag. I think there's some characters that were not done justice, but I think there's some characters that absolutely excel. So for me, it's a 6 out of 10. To be honest with you, when I was watching this, I was kind of thinking, oh, I really enjoyed this. It's probably going to be a 7 out of 10 for me. But as a series as a whole, I've got to say, I think it's still an above average show for me. And if you like Game of Thrones, I would suggest giving it a check out. But yeah, it's an above average show without being fantastic. So it's a 6 out of 10 for me. I'll be curious to know what your thoughts are, and on the whole lot of woke stuff. I really try to avoid identity politics on this channel if I can help it, but there's been such a hoopla about this whole thing. I thought I had to kind of address it and give my thoughts on it. So yes, there you go. Love to hear what your thoughts are on this. Let me know, and I look forward to seeing you next time.